There. I'm going to spend some time today talking about the political regime in Russia, and we will begin, as we generally do, with the written constitution. The backstory here is important, I think, to understanding why it is that this constitution is arranged in the way that it is. And in order to understand that, we need to rewind to 1991. By now, hopefully, you are aware that in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, it falls apart, it fragments into Russia and a number of other constituent republics turned sovereign states. And Boris Yeltsin, who you see depicted here, is the new president of Russia. A problem that Yeltsin faces pretty much immediately is that although he's leading a new country, he doesn't have a new constitution, and he has not only the same legislative institutions as the Soviet constitution had provided for, he actually has the same legislature. And a lot of the members of that legislature are old school conservatives who are very suspicious of Yeltsin's policies, which basically call for rapid economic liberalization. So between 1991 and 1993, tensions between Yeltsin and the legislature are going to escalate until they reach the point of a constitutional crisis, when in 1993, Yeltsin says, I'm going to dissolve the legislature. I'm going to send everybody home and have new elections because I think that these people are stonewalling my program for getting Russia back on track. Yeltsin doesn't have any power to do this. There's nothing in the Soviet constitution that allows the president to just blow up the legislature like this. But he tries to do it anyway. A number of the legislators will barricade themselves in the legislative building, which is confusingly called the White House. And Yeltsin will respond by sending in the army, which actually brings in tanks and fires shells at its own legislative building in order to get these legislators to get out and go home. So having conquered his own legislature by this illegal act of force, Yeltsin will proceed to push through a new constitution. And as you might imagine, that new constitution is going to give a whole lot more power to the president of Russia. That's the basic document that we have to work with today. Fast forward to 2000, when Vladimir Putin, the current president, first takes power. Under Putin, the basic situation that we see is a combination of formal adherence to the letter of the law. You don't see Putin just outright violating the Constitution in really obvious or blatant ways, and yet Putin is going to manipulate the laws and manipulate the Constitution in ways that allow him to increase his own power and turn Russia increasingly into a more and more authoritarian regime. And that's the basic dynamic that you want to be paying attention to as you analyze the degree to which Vladimir Putin has really centralized power under himself and eliminated much effective political competition in Russia. One heads up for you, and I'll flag this a couple of times during this lecture as well, is that Putin pushes through a major package of constitutional reforms in 2020. So that's after, if you have any addition to this textbook, basically, that version is not going to account for those constitutional changes. I will talk about those changes at the very end of this lecture, and I will try and flag for you things that are going to change when I get to that very end point. Okay, so let's start with the executive. And one term that's useful to understand as an American looking into Russia is the word Kremlin. That is shorthand for executive power in Russia. Literally, the Kremlin refers to the palace complex in Moscow, the capital, that serves as the residence for the president, that used to be the residence of the czars in Imperial Russia. But it's often used to just describe kind of executive power in Russia in the same way that the White House often stands in for the actions of the president's government in the United States. Your English teacher will tell you that that is metonymy. Russia has uniquely among the case study countries for the AP CompGov course a semi-presidential system, meaning that the head of state and the head of government are different people with different sources of power. The head of state is the president. That's Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is the person who is most central to any of our case study countries in this course. I'm going to say his name a whole lot. The president's powers are pretty extensive for reasons that I just talked about. The president has the power to appoint and to dismiss the prime minister and the cabinet, although that's going to change with the 2020 reforms. He has the power to appoint leaders of federal districts, which are basically big groupings of subnational units. I'll talk about those a little bit more when we get to local government, but that basically gives the president the power or a different lever for kind of superintending and surveilling local governments and making sure that they stay in line with his overall agenda. The president can go into the legislature and directly propose legislation. He can also veto bills that have been passed by the legislature. He can also issue decrees which have the binding force of law, and this has been an important way in the last 30 years for Russian presidents to get around an uncompliant legislature. The president is directly in charge of a number of key ministries. He's in charge of the foreign ministry, the interior ministry, which oversees security, and he's also in charge ultimately of the FSB, which is the Federal Security Service. That's the successor to the KGB, which you no doubt have heard of at some point in your life. The president can be impeached, but the bar for doing that is fairly high. First, the High Court has to approve the charges against the president, and then it takes a two-thirds vote in each chamber of the legislature to remove the president from office. Needless to say, this has not happened successfully in Russia, although they did try under Yeltsin. The other executive official you need to know about is the prime minister. The prime minister is the head of government in Russia, giving them day-to-day responsibilities for overseeing the civil service, chairing meetings of the cabinet, etc., etc. They are nominated by the president and then approved by the Duma, although, again, put an asterisk on that. That's going to change in 2020. And they oversee the civil service. They are in charge of day-to-day government operations. The prime minister is responsible for proposing a budget to the Duma every year, and they can also propose other legislation if they want to. One important thing to note is that unlike in a straightforward parliamentary system, such as that of the United Kingdom, the prime minister is not a member of the Duma. He's not a member of the legislature, and he doesn't necessarily have to come from its majority party. The prime minister in Russia has to win support from the Duma in order to be confirmed in that office after the president nominates them. But their powers don't come from the legislature in the same way as the prime minister's powers come from the legislature in a straightforwardly parliamentary system. And so there's not necessarily that same prime ministers in Russia don't necessarily rise through the ranks of a popular political party. Sometimes they're just sort of technocrats or experienced civil servants or bureaucrats who are favored by the president for their administrative abilities. It's worth thinking about a couple of recent, like just the timeline of the last 20 years of Russian political history in order to try and understand the way in which the balance of power within the executive has shifted. Vladimir Putin serves 2 four-year terms as president starting in 2000. He's reelected in 2004, and then he has to step down from office in 2008 because Russia's constitution limits the president to 2 consecutive terms. And the word consecutive is important here for reasons that will become obvious to you in about 5.5 seconds. So Putin steps down in 2008, and his protege, a guy named Dmitry Medvedev, succeeds him as president, as the candidate of Putin's party. Putin is then nominated and confirmed as prime minister. So essentially, he steps back to this, what is generally considered the less powerful executive position. But it is widely believed that between 2008 and 2012, Putin remains the single most powerful figure in Russian politics. So Medvedev, as president, has all of the formal powers, but Putin, through his political influence, is actually calling a lot of the shots. This idea that Medvedev is basically operating as a puppet of Putin, or at least as being extremely deferential to Putin, is widely confirmed in a lot of observers' eyes when in 2012, Medvedev decides that he is not going to run for a second term as president, even though he could be eligible. Putin, having sat out one term, is eligible to run again, and so he's elected as president in 2012. While he was sitting around being the prime minister, the term of the presidency in Russia has been lengthened to 6 years, so Putin doesn't have to stand for re-election until 2018. So currently, as I'm recording this lecture in the summer of 2021, Putin is serving his second term in a row as president, and the term limit will hit in 2024. But wait, there's more, as you're going to keep hearing me say when we talk about the Russian Constitution. Some constitutional amendments that are passed in 2020 are going to change the term limit situation, and you're just going to have to hold your breath until I get to the end of this lecture and tell you how that works. But right now, let's go over to the legislature. Russia has a bicameral legislature called the Federal Assembly. Lower house is the Duma, the upper house is the Federation Council. The Duma consists of 450 elected members. All of its members are elected through a mixed system of single-member district plurality and proportional representation. Their terms are 5 years long. The Duma's job the Duma is by far, although it's called the lower house, it's by far the more important and more powerful house of the legislature, similar situation to the United Kingdom, where the lower house actually does most of the legislating. And so its members can propose and debate and pass legislation. The Duma can override the president's veto with a 2/3 vote. They also have the power to approve or or reject the prime minister or the president's choice for prime minister. If the Duma rejects the same nominee for prime minister 3 times in a row, this will trigger new elections. That hasn't happened, but the Duma did at one point under Yeltsin reject a candidate for prime minister twice, at which point Yeltsin said, actually, I don't think that new elections would necessarily be favorable to me because I seem to have upset a lot of people. So I'm going to nominate a different prime minister. So that does give the Duma certain powers to check the president. They can also similarly check the prime minister by holding a vote of no confidence. So here's where we see one of the parliamentary aspects of this semi-presidential system. As we said earlier, the Duma does have the power to participate in impeachment proceedings against the president. That's characteristic of the presidential system. But they can also hold a vote of no confidence in the prime minister and cabinet. So the cabinet is, to some degree, accountable to the Duma as well as to the president. If the Duma holds a vote of no confidence twice in a row, then either the president has to dismiss the prime minister and cabinet or hold new elections for the Duma. Purely theoretical, has not yet happened in Russian history. Today, although you can see from this list that the Duma theoretically has some significant powers to check executive power, in practice, the Duma is overwhelmingly today dominated by United Russia, which is the political party of Vladimir Putin, and it really has not operated as a particularly effective check on the power of the executive. It is today a fairly compliant body. In principle, it has the power to check the executive. In practice, this just doesn't seem to be happening. The other chamber of Russia's legislature, the upper house, is called the Federation Council, a corresponding institution to the United States Senate, but with some really significant differences. It currently consists of 170 members, and these members are appointed. They are not directly elected. Each subnational unit of government in Russia has 2 members of the Federation Council. They're known as senators. The Federation Council has legislative powers in a really narrowly restricted range of activities. So unlike in the United States, it is not the case that every bill passed by the Duma then has to go through the Federation Council before going to the president's desk for a signature. The Federation Council has to approve the budget. It has to approve treaties with other countries. It has to approve the president's nominees to the Constitutional Court, which is Russia's highest court. And it has to approve deployment of troops abroad. But that doesn't mean that it has to, but that gives the Federation Council pretty limited powers, pretty limited opportunities to weigh in on Russian politics. If the Federation Council says no to any of those proposals, which do fall within its remit, the Duma can actually override it with a 2/3 vote. Let's move on finally to the judicial branch. It's worth noting that before 1991, whether under the Soviet Union or under the imperial system, there's no real strong history of judicial independence in Russia. That's not necessarily a knock on Russia. I don't intend that as a normative statement, although you could turn it into one if you wanted to. It's simply not the point of either the Soviet or the imperial systems to have an independent body of judges and courts and lawyers operating as an effective check on the rest of government. So you should probably lower your expectations with respect to the ability of Russia's judiciary to hold the other 2 branches to account and to constrain their powers. There are 2 high courts in Russia, and they serve separate functions. The Constitutional Court is the one that we tend to care about in CompGov. This is the court that renders decisions on major constitutional and legal issues. There are 19 judges on it, and again, they're nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Federation Council. That's one of its limited powers to weigh in as a legislative body. The Constitutional Court has the power of judicial review, both abstract and concrete, meaning that it can strike down laws and decisions that it deems to be unconstitutional, whether or not they have actually injured somebody or whether somebody has simply asked them to weigh in on a legal issue. In practice, the Constitutional Court has been very compliant with the executive. They have not used their powers of judicial review to significantly hinder Putin's pursuit of his governing agenda. There's a different court in Russia called the Supreme Court. This is the final court of appeal in criminal cases. They matter less in terms of interpreting the Constitution, but it's just worth noting that in some countries, and Russia is one of them, the court system separates out those functions of hearing appeals in criminal cases versus deciding major constitutional issues. One thing to note about the law in Russia in general is this term rule by law, which I'll also use in the context of talking about the Chinese judiciary. We've talked in this course before, especially when defining democracy, about rule of law, which is the idea that the laws apply equally to everybody and should be enforced impartially for their own sake, even if that gets in the way of the government's agenda. In Russia, what we see is something considerably different. In Russia, the pattern has been for the government to use laws and to use the judicial system for its own political ends. So, if you are an opposition politician in Russia, if you are critical of Putin's government or of Putin's political party, you are much more likely to be investigated for tax fraud or for embezzlement or for basically any other crime in a way that's likely to mess up your life and potentially render you ineligible to run for office in Russia. We'll talk about an example of that later in this course with Alexei Navalny. So the legal system is used as a tool that the government has to pursue its political agenda, but the laws are not necessarily enforced neutrally and fairly. And in particular, there's pretty significant accusations of corruption among Putin's sort of inner circle of people who have benefited financially to a tremendous degree from his government. Elections in Russia. I think that there's some, Americans who basically talk about Russia in a lazy way, as if it does not have elections. Period. I think I'm never going to tell you that elections in Putin's Russia are particularly free or fair, but there are elections, and it's important for this course that you understand the rules, even if you know that they might be broken at various points. For the presidency, the president of Russia is directly elected, national popular vote. There is a majority requirement. In theory, there has to be a runoff if nobody achieves a majority in the initial election for the presidency. The nomination requirements are pretty high to get on the ballot to run for president of Russia. There's two ways to get on the ballot. One is that you can be the candidate of a party that has some seats in the Duma already. In other words, you have to belong to a party that has already made it through the various hurdles that make it somewhat difficult to get political representation in Russia. So that's one way of controlling access to the ballot for president. Is that there's a pretty short list of parties that have any seats in the Duma, and many of those, as we'll talk about when we get to political competition, are effectively not going to present a serious threat to Putin's government. The other option is that theoretically you can run as an independent candidate for the presidency, but you need 2 million signatures, which is a fairly high bar. So, long story short, it's somewhat difficult to get on the ballot for president of Russia. Also worth noting, there have been some changes. The 2020 constitutional amendments affected presidential term limits, so I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Other major elections in Russia are for the Duma at the national level. There are also Dumas at the local level. I'll talk about that later today. The Duma elections currently run under a mixed electoral system. Half of those 450 seats are elected through single-member district plurality. Half of them are elected through proportional representation. And it's worth noting, there's no need to get bogged down in the precise timeline here, but it's worth noting that under Putin, there have been a bunch of different changes to the electoral system. So the mixed system was in place before 2007, but then in 2007, a law was passed to shift the system to only proportional representation. And the theory there was that if all candidates are beholden to their parties for their appearance on the proportional representation lists, then parties will have more control over legislators in the Duma, and there will be less of a threat that independent candidates will come in bringing new ideas and challenging the system. But then in 2016, we saw a shift back to this 50-50 split. We saw the reintroduction of the single-member district plurality element of elections. And the theory there is that Putin's party, United Russia, tends to do better in single-member district plurality elections for reasons that we've probably talked about when we talked about electoral systems in the abstract. They just tend to favor major parties with high name recognition. And so that shift back to the mixed system, in theory, has reduced the possibility that minor parties will be able to get seats in the Duma and then present serious challenges to the government through proportional representation, which, as you know, tends to advantage smaller parties. Local governments. So Russia has a unique system. It's a federal state. If anybody is asking you to put Russia into the bucket of federal or unitary, the answer is federal, and there's not a lot of ambiguity about that. But Russia has an interesting spin on this known as asymmetric federalism, which means that different subnational units of government have different levels of political autonomy. One thing worth noting is that Russia has a bunch of different names for different subnational units of government. Some of them are called republics, some of them are called oblasts, some of them are called krais, some of them are called called federal districts, and there's probably a couple others that I'm missing. There's a Jewish autonomous oblast all the way out in the east, whose population is now less than 1% Jewish. So I'm going to call these subnational units in order to try and save a little bit of time. The backstory to this is that in the 1990s, when Yeltsin is coming to power, when the Soviet Union is disintegrating, there's serious concern at the top levels of Russian political leadership that ethnic minority regions are going to break away because they've already seen this in some of the Soviet constituent republics that declare independence in 1989, 1990, 1991. And so Yeltsin's going to cut deals with a variety of local leaders, essentially saying, I'm going to grant you considerably more autonomy if you're going to be willing to stay in the Russian Federation. And that helps limit the degree of territorial deterioration that Russia goes through in 1991. So under asymmetric federalism, there's a number of ethnic minority regions, and most of these are called republics, that have a little bit more autonomy than majority Russian regions. And in particular, some of these regions have the right to write their own regional constitution, and some of them have the right to have an official language in addition to Russian. So the idea there is we will respect some degree of ethnic diversity, of cultural pluralism in exchange for your continued membership in this political entity. All those subnational units of government, regardless of their level of autonomy, are represented in the Federation Council. The governor of each subnational unit appoints one of its senators, and then the local Duma appoints its other senators. Putin, that said, Putin, since he came to power, has done a lot to try and reduce the autonomy of the subnational units of government. Putin expressed shortly after coming to power this idea of trying to institute what he called a power vertical, which is basically stronger lines of control between the president in Moscow and the various regional and local governments. So a couple of things that he has done. Some of his changes have been just super petty. So most of the governors prior to 2000 of these ethnic minority republics had the title president. Putin has changed most of their titles to something that sounds less powerful than president. But some of these changes have really, really substantial political implications as well. So in 2000, Putin created a number of federal districts, which are basically bigger groupings of subnational governments. Today, there are 8 different federal districts. Each federal district has a head who is appointed by the president, and that basically gives the president a point person in every region to try and make sure that these local governments are staying in line. Number 2, Putin has done a number of things to reduce autonomy for those ethnic minority subnational units of government. A number of those subnational units of government have been merged with units that have less autonomy, and they've taken on the political status of the less autonomous regions. Some of those, the Yeltsin era agreements that gave them more autonomy have come up for renewal, and Putin has just declined to renew them. And so these subnational units that under the system of asymmetric federalism had enjoyed more autonomy are gradually seeing that autonomy reduced. Finally, there's been some shifts in the policy around governors of subnational units of government, which had been directly elected. In 2004, Putin just straight up abolished the elections of governors in the regions. In 2011, there were significant protests around elections generally in Russia. And so part of the government's response to that was to restore those elections in 2012, but with fairly high barriers for candidates to get on the ballot. So the result is that United Russia, Putin's party, tends to dominate gubernatorial elections in much of Russia today. Then in 2013, another law was passed that allowed some regions, if they wanted, to cancel elections for governors and instead choose their own governor, have the local legislature, the local Duma, choose their own governor. And just to help them out, the Kremlin would hand them a list of suggested candidates. So you can see a variety of ways in which these legal changes have been used to reduce the degree to which local governments can present a challenge to the power of Putin and of Russia's central governments. Okay, I've been promising you that I would talk about constitutional changes. I am sure that you have been waiting with bated breath for this disquisition, and so we are finally here. Get excited. In 2020, Putin pushes through the legislature and then has a totally unnecessary national referendum to ratify a variety of amendments to Russia's constitution. I'm going to walk you through some of the major changes that are introduced. In the description of this video, you can find a link to some more detailed explanation of these changes, and then I'll try and give you at least one hypothesis about what it all means. So some of these amendments affirm the supremacy of Russian law over international law. You've seen Putin over the course of his rule try and kind of combat the international community and criticize particularly the European Union for trying and meddle in his affairs and being overly critical of Russia's increasing trend toward authoritarianism. And so one comeback to that is just for the Constitution to say Russian law wins if there's ever a conflict with international law. Some of the amendments enhance the president's powers over security and over the judiciary, over Russia's police forces. Some of them formalized a role for what had previously been a kind of ceremonial body called the State Council. That had been a committee which included the governors of the different regions and also various other people appointed by the president. And some of those amendments increased the powers of the State Council and just wrote its role into the Constitution. Some of the most highly publicized and highly discussed implications of these amendments were surrounding presidential term limits. So remember that the previous rule in Russia's constitution was that the president could serve 2 consecutive terms, but there was no total lifetime term limit. The new amendments made that rule tighter, saying the president can only serve 2 terms total, regardless of whether they're consecutive or not. However, at the 11th hour, a cosmonaut who I think is like 83, I am not making this up, came on the floor and she said, "I think we should reset the clock for Vladimir Putin." And there's a lot of speculation that, of course, this was staged, that this was not just this 83-year-old cosmonaut's idea. But nonetheless, regardless of how it happened, another amendment was written in that said, whoever happens to be president when these amendments are ratified, i.e. Vladimir Putin, will have the clock reset. So the implication of that, if I'm doing the math correctly, is that Putin will, if he wants to, be able to run again for president in 2024 and then in 2030, and then he will be all set to legally serve as president if he wants to and if he gets elected until the year 2036. Last change, and this might seem to cut in the opposite direction of what I've said so far, is actually to shift some more powers to the Duma, giving them the power to choose the prime minister instead of having the president make that nomination, and the power to choose most cabinet members, with the exceptions of some of those really important security and foreign policy related ministries that we've already talked about. So, what does this all mean? Why make all of these changes? There's a whole lot of ink been spilled in the United States, in Russia, and in Europe and elsewhere about what Vladimir Putin is thinking, and I think we all can say we lack the power to read his mind. But the theory that makes the most sense to me personally is this. Putin might have a desire at some point in his career to step back from the day-to-day management of Russia's government. And in particular, in the last few years, as oil prices have dropped, as Russia's economy has hit kind of a slowdown, that linkage with the day-to-day economic situation of Russia has damaged Putin's popularity, and he might want to be able to back off to lay the blame for the economic situation at somebody else's feet. That might be a reason for exiting the presidency, or it might be a reason for making parliament and the prime minister somewhat more powerful. And so, in theory, Putin might want to be creating for himself a position at a slightly more distant remove from the day-to-day management of Russia's government so that he can keep his hands on the levers of power without potentially suffering that damage to his popularity that comes every time the economy goes south in Russia. A related theory is that if Putin believes that he's going to have to step out of the presidency eventually, he might actually want to start weakening the presidency now so that whoever takes over from him can't come after him or can't damage his legacy. I should say this is all speculation. I'm mostly repeating ideas from people who are smarter than me. I will try and provide you with links to their thinking so you can evaluate whether you agree with it yourself. But that, I think, is the picture that makes sense. That's the theory that, for me, makes the most sense in terms of making all these constitutional changes a semi-coherent whole. That is it. We will have much more to say when I see you in class, I'm sure. Thanks very much.